Thanks for tuning in to this sermon that was recorded at Victory Baptist Church on April 4th, 2021, as part of a series through the book of Hebrews with Pastor Dax Bryant. Today's message is from Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 3.
If you would, open your Bibles, please, to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. If you've been around the last, 6 months or so, you'll know we've been working through Hebrews chapter 11. And really, as you open your Bible to Hebrews chapter 12, I want you to just ignore the fact that it's the start of a new chapter in your Bible. Because really, these first three verses especially are an extension of, and actually the climax of everything that we've been saying about faith in those previous 40 verses of Hebrews chapter 11. So let me read Hebrews 12, the first three verses, and then we'll pray. Hebrews chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. This is the word of the Lord. Let's pray. Our gracious God and loving Father, we can think about the great stories of the Bible that we know, the many stories we've seen even in Hebrews 11. How great, for example, was the joy of Israel when the Egyptian armies died upon the shore of the Red Sea. Or the people of Israel when the walls of Jericho came crumbling down. But yet far greater is our joy when Jesus, our Redeemer's foe, lay crushed in the dust. And we see Jesus stride forth as the victor, the conqueror of death and hell and sin and all opposition. He has bursted the bands of death. He has trampled the powers of darkness. He lives forever. And he is our gracious pledge. He is our guarantee who made payment for our debt. And now he has come forth from the prison house of the grave, free and triumphant over sin and Satan and death. And God, now we see in his resurrection the proof that his vicarious offering was accepted, that your claims of justice are satisfied, that the devil's scepter has been shattered, and that his wrongful throne has been torn down. And God, we ask that you would give us the assurance that as we die in Christ, in him we will also rise. In his life we live, in his victory we triumph, in his ascension we too will be glorified. Jesus, our Redeemer, you who were lifted up on a cross have now ascended to highest heaven. You who as a man of sorrows was crowned with thorns, you are now the Lord of life, wreathed with glory. Once there was no shame more deep than yours, no agony more bitter, no death more cruel. But now there is no exaltation more high, no life more glorious, no advocate more effective. What more could be done than what you have done? Your death is our life. Your resurrection is our peace. Your ascension is our hope. Your prayers are our comfort. And so, God, now we ask that through your word and by your Spirit, you would speak to us on this day, the day that the Lord has made. Amen. Christianity is not a call to the momentary glory of a martyr's death. It is, rather, a daily taking up of the cross. Jesus said, "Follow me." That's not just a death to die, that's a life to live. Now, we have learned from our time in Hebrews chapter 11 that real Christianity, authentic Christianity, is not just a moment of faith. It's not just a decision that you make once. It's not just a prayer that you pray once. Authentic Christianity is a life of faith that is characterized, that is evident in a long obedience. A long obedience to Jesus Christ. When you look at the New Testament, it describes the Christian life with a few different metaphors. It talks about it as a war to be waged, a fight to be fought, a cross to be borne. But here in Hebrews chapter 12, the Christian life is likened to a race that is to be run. A race where the prize, the victor's prize, is not given to those who merely start the race, but it's exclusively given to those who complete the race, who finish the race that God has marked out for them. In fact, the heart and soul of what's in these three verses, these first three verses here, really all hinges on one word in the last sentence of verse 1. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. It's set before us. By who? God. God in his providence gives each one of you a unique race to run. He sets it before you, who gives you the course, and it is yours to run. Your race is not my race. My race is not your race. Each one of us has a unique race to run. And while that is true, that each one of us has an individual race that we're in with different obstacles to overcome, perhaps, it's also true that each of our races is to be run in a certain way. That is to say, it's not a wind sprint. It's not a short burst of faith. We are told here in Hebrews 12 to run with endurance. The Christian race is not a race that is defined so much by speed as it is by stamina and steadiness and perseverance. Let us run with endurance. So if you are a believer, you have a race to run. The question we want to look at today is, how do you run it? And if the prize is only for those who finish the race and not merely those who just start the race, how can you be certain of pushing on to the very end and crossing the finish line? That's the big question we're asking. How do you, believer, how do you run the race that God has uniquely set before you? Now, in these three verses, there's a lot of words. We couldn't even fit all three verses on the screen at the same time without making it really small. So there's a lot of words there. I want to give you just three words to help simplify what's here. How do we run the race? How do you run this race? Here's the first word: listen. The first word is listen. Listen to the testimony of those who have already finished the race. That's what's implied in the first part of verse 1. Therefore, so right there, that word tells you this is not the start of a new thought. This is pointing backwards to chapter 11. Therefore, so in light of all those names, all those stories, all those examples that were given in chapter 11, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. Now, we need to perhaps correct some thinking about this. These witnesses, what they're doing. These are not just passive observers. The picture is not so much a giant stadium in heaven with the believers of old looking down on you to watch you live out your lives. I think they have better things to do with their time, quite frankly. Biblically speaking, witnesses are more than just people who see something happen. Witnesses are people who do something about it. Witnesses speak. They testify. Specifically, they speak for and about Jesus Christ. And the point is here in verse 1 that looking backwards to chapter 11, beginning with Abel and working all through the history of the Old Testament, we are surrounded. We have this heritage of a vast number of people who have already faithfully finished their respective races. And now, with one unified voice, they are urging you to do the same, to finish the race that God has set before you, trusting in God's great promises, just like they did. It's like they're saying to us, for all of the pitfalls and the obstacles and the perils that you will encounter in the race of faith, you must never fear as though the outcome of the race is in doubt. And that's true whether you're looking back and talking about Noah or Abraham or Moses or David or you. The fact is, God is always unchangeably good and faithful. And he will always prove himself to be unchangeably good and faithful to those who run the race that is set before them. So how do you run this race of faith, believer? First of all, you must listen. You must place yourself under the steady influence of the testimony of believers who are found right here in your Bible, on the pages of Scripture. People who've already finished the race and who now can give you a witness, a perspective on God's uncompromising faithfulness toward his people. So you want to run the race? You want to finish the race? Listen. That's the first word. The second word that is essential to running this race is divest. Divest. To run this race successfully all the way through to its conclusion means that you must divest yourself of everything that impedes your progress. It's the middle of verse 1. Let us also lay aside, divest, every weight and sin which clings so closely. This divesting, this throwing off everything, it refers to the Greek custom of the day. Perhaps you're familiar with this, where a runner in a race back in the day would strip down of all his clothes before he ran so that he wouldn't be hindered by anything. Not sure how that worked. But here, the writer, he orders a double divestment, a double throwing off. Notice that there. He says, first, lay aside every weight, or maybe your translation says hindrance. And second, lay aside every sin. Every weight, every sin, a double divestment. Now, every weight, that might include things that are sinful, like lust or pride or covetousness. Or a weight may be something that isn't necessarily sinful in itself, but it can become sinful when it reaches the point where it impedes your spiritual growth and maturity. So, I don't know, take Netflix, for example, right? Not sinful in and of itself necessarily, but it can become sinful when it impedes and interferes with your spiritual maturity and growth. So would you like me to give you a list of what those kinds of things are? Well, I can't, right? Because I don't know what those kinds of things are for you. I could maybe guess about some of you, but I'm more worried about trying to be mindful of what those things are for me. So how can you know what they are for you? You ready for this? Start running the race. You want to know what's in your way? What's impeding your progress? Start running, and it will become very obvious. And then you'll have to deal with it. You'll have to divest yourself of it. So what is it for you? A hobby that's become an obsession? Politics? A friendship? An addiction to social media? A personal goal? A particular genre of movies? A guilty pleasure? And if you're thinking, oh, I'm not really aware of any weights or hindrances that are in my life, then I need to be honest with you, with all due respect, you're probably not running the race. Because only those who fail to run don't feel any resistance. Like this afternoon, after we're done here, when we go home and we have the ham that hopefully turned out okay, and I change into my sweatpants and I put on my slippers and I lay down on the couch, I'm not going to feel any hindrances because I'm not running at all. Running is the last thing in my mind. But if, for some reason, I decided to actually get up and go for a jog, then all of those hindrances, all of those weights would become obvious, right? Maybe that was a little too much ham. These sweatpants are kind of big and baggy. These slippers don't have the arch support I need to run. See what I mean? You're only mindful, you're only not mindful of hindrances if you're not running. Here we're told, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. How do we do that? First, we listen. We listen to the testimony of those who finished the race. Second, we divest. We divest ourselves of every weight and every sin. We deal with it. And that brings us to our third summary word, and this is where we want to camp out here the rest of the time we have this morning. And that third word is focus. Focus. If you're going to run the race that God has marked out for you, you must focus your attention on the greatest of all runners. The only one who has actually run his race perfectly. That's the point here of this passage. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. How do we do that? Verse 2, looking to Jesus. Looking to Jesus. You're running the race and you're looking to Jesus. Those two things are happening simultaneously. So in other words, for every step that you take as you're running that race, you must be steadily preoccupied, ruthlessly focused on Jesus Christ. Now you know this if you've ever run before, or maybe even if you've just watched a race on TV. A successful runner is not focused on the crowd. He's not focused on the other runners. He's not even really focused on himself. If he stared at his own feet, that would be a disaster. Instead, he keeps his eyes up and ahead on the end, on the finish line, and he runs straight for it. And for the Christian, the end, the finish line is Jesus Christ. And so your focus can't be on the race itself. Why don't I make the kind of money I want to make? I'm not in a satisfying relationship. My children have gone wayward. I hate the house that we live in. You hear people talk like that all the time. Maybe you think those things regularly. Those are things that are focused on the race. Don't focus on the race. Nor are you to focus on the other runners who are running with you. How come that guy's so far ahead? Why isn't she running like I am? Nor are you to focus on yourself as you run. Am I praying enough? Am I serving enough? Am I holy enough? Am I witnessing enough? Am I giving enough? Now, please hear me. Introspection, right, that process of self-examination, that certainly has a very valid and valuable place in the Christian life. But it can also easily slip into something that's counterproductive. There's a reason, if you come here regularly, that we don't send you home every week with the last words out of our mouth. Now go and look inside of yourself for the answers. Because if you look inside of yourself with any kind of honesty, you're going to be pretty discouraged. And if you're not discouraged, you're not looking long enough or hard enough. Looking inside to take stock is okay. Looking inside all the time, constantly, is devastating to the running of this race. Because you can only run straight when your eyes are up and ahead and focused on the one who stands at the finish line calling you in to himself. So if you intend to finish the race, if you intend to win the prize, then you must intentionally shape your life so that it is altogether preoccupied and focused on Christ. You need to hear of him. You need to read of him. You need to speak of him, learn about him. Jesus needs to be the focus of your life if you're going to run the race of faith and finish it. Why do we look to Jesus? We've just coming out of Hebrews 11 here. Why not look to Moses or David or Abraham or Paul or Peter? Well, the writer gives us two reasons. Here's the first reason. Because only Jesus ran his race absolutely perfectly. Jesus is the consummate, climactic model of faith, and that is why he is worthy of our relentless focus. That's why that big number 12 in your Bible at the beginning of this chapter is not very helpful in this case, because this really does flow right out of chapter 11, where there's this great cloud of witnesses that we must listen to as they give their testimony about God. But even as we listen to them, we never become preoccupied with them, because the truth is all of those Old Testament saints preached a better message than they lived. Just like me. That's why you have to watch out for what I've heard called the killer bees when you're reading your Old Testament. You know what I mean, the killer bees? Be like Moses, be like Abraham, be like David. Really? Which David do you have in mind? The one who defeated Goliath or the one who committed adultery and murder? Which Abraham are you thinking about? The one who left behind everything he knew and walked out in faith? Or the Abraham who lied twice about his wife, putting her in danger? Which Moses? The one who led his people out of Egypt, or the one who killed a man in a rash instant? See, Abraham, as great as he was, he didn't run the race without flaw. Moses didn't finish his race without stumbling. David knew what it was like to be ensnared with entangling sins. The point is, there is only one man who ran the race that was set before him in absolute perfection. And here, notice this, the writer refers to him, not as he's referred to him in other parts of this letter of Hebrews, as the Messiah or as the Son, but here he refers to him simply as Jesus. Jesus. And in referring to him like that, he's stressing, he's emphasizing that this greatest of all runners, this example that we look to, was truly a man. He had a name. He had earthly family. He ran this race as a human being. He's called there in verse 2, the founder and perfecter of our faith. I want to look at that for a second. What does that mean? Because this is a title here, really. It's a title that identifies Jesus as the greatest of all runners in this race of faith. And it shows us why, another reason why you need to be focused on him. So he's the founder of our faith. And what's being talked about here isn't the fact that Jesus is the originator of our faith or the cause of our faith, though that is very much true. The idea here is that Jesus is the chief leader in this race of faith. He's out in front. Sort of like if you go later and look back in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 20, Jesus is called our forerunner there. Our forerunner. It's another kind of athletic metaphor. It has to do with the idea of a runner who breaks away from the pack, who goes out into the front and who crosses the finish line first. But a forerunner implies that there are other runners behind who will come and complete the race as well. This term here, this founder of our faith, and this forerunner, it carries the idea of a pioneer. Maybe your translation says that. A pioneer, a leader who has blazed the path for others who will follow and come after him. So that's the founder of our faith. Then he's called the perfecter of our faith. And that elevates his status even further, because he's not just the last name in this long list of names that started in Hebrews 11 and spills over into Hebrews 12. He's not just the latest and greatest in this long history. He is being revealed here intentionally at the end as the ultimate man of faith. He's not just the pioneering founder of faith who makes the way for you, though he is that, but also his earthly life and his ministry displayed what faith is, absolutely and perfectly. And so as the founder and perfecter of our faith, you put those two together, Jesus shows us what the life of faith really is. If you really desire to run and to finish the race that God has set before you, Jesus is the one that you must relentlessly look to. Not Abraham, not Moses, not David, all of whom ran less than perfect races. Your eyes must be focused on Jesus Christ, who ran the race that the Father ordained for him without the slightest imperfection. And to emphasize that just a little bit more, notice here the writer of Hebrews, he highlights 3 specific aspects of the race run by Jesus. Very quickly here, middle of verse 2, notice, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. This was part of his race. The cross was a part of his race that the Father assigned to him. Jesus Christ took upon himself the guilt of people, and he bore the full extent of their punishment on the cross. And then secondly, notice despising the shame. In other words, he gave no regard to all of the contempt that he would receive as a result of dying that shameful kind of death that he died. And third, notice there, as a reward for his faithfulness, God raises Jesus from the dead. He ascends into heaven, and we're told he is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. He now has universal sovereignty. As the founder, the pioneer, he paved the way for you. As the perfecter, he has displayed a perfect model of faith for you. And as the forerunner, his very presence there at the finish line, having already crossed it, guarantees this sequence of runners who will follow after him, namely all of you who have placed your trust in Jesus Christ. So do you get the imagery here? Jesus has completed the race perfectly. And now he's looking back toward all of you who are running. And it's like he's leaning across the tape in your direction. And he's saying, run, Paul. Run, Frank. Run, Val. Run, Bobby. Run, Josh. Keep going. I finished the race. Keep running. Keep looking at me. I was victorious, and you will be too. Focus on Jesus. That's how you will get there. That's why, whether you know it or not, or realize it or not, that's why we work so hard, especially when we come together on the Lord's Day, to sing songs, for example, that say something substantial about Jesus Christ and what he's done, rather than songs about us and how we feel. It's why we celebrate the Lord's Supper on a regular basis. It's why we insist that when we open up God's Word and preach, we must point to Jesus Christ every single Sunday. Do you want to run the race of faith all the way to the end and cross the finish line? The ultimate answer is make Jesus Christ the preoccupation of your life. Focus on him. And more specifically, give yourself to the great redemptive accomplishments that are done, that are finished by him in the gospel. Some of you have been Christians for very long amounts of time. But don't ever think that you are mature enough or that you've arrived enough where you can now graduate beyond the gospel. There's no faster way for you to make a shipwreck of your faith than to think you've moved beyond the gospel. You need to always be fixing your eyes on Jesus, whether you've been a Christian for 3 days or 30 years. Fix your eyes on Jesus, not your career, not even your family, not your financial portfolio. Fix your eyes on Jesus, and you never get beyond him. Isn't that what compelled you to start running the race in the first place? It was Jesus. That's what motivates you to endure the race. It's what causes you to get up again and start running when you trip over your sin and you fall down on your face. Is that true for you? Is that true of your Christian experience? Think about this. When you think and you feel like your faith is strong, isn't that tied directly to how preoccupied with Jesus you are at that moment, at that season? When you are reading about Jesus, when you are thinking about Jesus, when you are praying to Jesus, when you are singing of Jesus, and when you're talking about Jesus with others, which is why, incidentally, you need to be gathered with other Christians at least on the Lord's Day, to say nothing of Bible studies or prayer meetings or other opportunities that you have to do that. When you're doing that, though, it's no coincidence that you find yourself more compelled to keep running towards him because you're preoccupied with him. And the opposite is true as well. When your preoccupation, for whatever reason, gets distracted from him, don't you find that your intensity to run the race lessens? Your zeal just kind of wanes, your passion fades, your steady running gives way to walking, and then your walking gives way to crawling, and then pretty soon you're just not just standing still, not just laying down, you're actually moving backwards. And so much of that dynamic is related to what your preoccupation is. Jesus or anything else. So how do you run this race of faith? Listen, divest, focus. Focus on the greatest of all runners. Why? 2 reasons. The first one, because only Jesus ran his race in absolute perfection. The second reason is because Jesus ran his race against the greatest opposition. Not only did he run his race in absolute perfection, but he ran it while facing unimaginable opposition. Verse 3, consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. So we get another athletic metaphor here, more racing language there, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. That's a phrase that was used to describe what an exhausted runner looked like when they came to the finish line, once they collapsed after they finished the race. You've seen that kind of thing happen, I'm sure, in a race before. They're just so exhausted they fall down. The concern here is that you don't collapse before you cross the finish line. That's the big deal. You started well, right? You got baptized, you joined a church, you started well. But if you collapse before you reach the finish, well, Jesus says in Matthew 10:22, only the one who endures to the end will be saved. So how do you prevent a catastrophic collapse? Focus your attention on the greatest of all runners, because only he ran his race perfectly, and not just that, because of what he endured while he was running it. He ran his race against the greatest opposition. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself. Consider him. Ponder him. It's a really strong word that's being used here. It means reflect on, compare with. He's saying, are you wearing down in this long race? Are you feeling the grind? Are you getting tired of all the resistance that is working against whatever progress you seem to be making? And of course, he's thinking, first of all, about these Hebrew Christians who are reading this letter for the first time. We saw that in chapter 10. Remember the things they were going through. Their Jewish families had ostracized them. They're under severe Roman persecution from the Roman government. They've been the objects of public ridicule. They've had their properties seized. Some of them have been imprisoned. And he's asking them, are you wearing down? Is all this stuff that you're facing, is it discouraging you? Here's what you do. Just think for a moment. Consider the magnitude of the opposition that Jesus faced, and then compare that with your own. What's the implication? Well, if on your behalf Jesus endured through everything that God had marked out for him, then certainly you can endure on his behalf the lesser suffering that God has marked out for you. Consider him. Ponder him. It's really interesting how the writer develops this idea. If you look back to the previous verse, verse 2, what he says about Jesus there's a line I kind of intentionally skipped over. Looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. You see that little word for in that sentence, in that phrase, who for the joy that was set before him? Sometimes that word means because of, which is how most people most of the time think about this. So you would read it like this: looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who because of the joy that was set before him endured the cross. Meaning that it was his ultimate reward in heaven that was the motivator for him to endure the cross and all the suffering. And that is true, and that is taught elsewhere. But that little word for, that little preposition, it's the little Greek word anti, and you can even hear it there, anti. Far more frequently, especially in the book of Hebrews, it doesn't mean because of, rather it means in place of, instead of. That's the idea here. So we would read it like this: looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who instead of the joy that was set before him, endured the cross. What does that mean? Well, in other words, instead of enjoying all of the eternal glories of heaven that are his by divine right, that he had as the Son of God, instead he condescended to take on human flesh and endure the cross. Philippians 2, though he was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. And you need to hold on to this, because this is why his sacrifice is far greater than any sacrifice you or I will ever have to make. You will never have to make the kind of sacrifice that Jesus made for you. That's why we can only look to him. Because the extent of his sacrifice, the magnitude of his sacrifice, is directly correlated to the extent of his condescension, how far down he came. He left heaven for earth. He left infinite glory for notorious poverty. He left kingship for slavery. He left peace and love and perfect relation for hatred and hostility. It started from the moment he was born, and it never stopped coming. He endured verbal reproach and physical attack and threats on his life and assaults on his character and betrayals and denials and beatings and mocking and finally death on a cross itself. And it's amazing, really, if you go back and read and then reflect upon the way that Jesus composed himself as he encountered all of these hostilities. Always meek in regard to people, always submissive in regard to God. He bore the greatest shame, the greatest reproach, the greatest indignity, the greatest injury, the greatest hostility, precisely because his was the greatest condescension. Notice that we're told, consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. We can't even get close to what Jesus did, but there's still something for us here. Why will a preoccupation with Jesus and the cross keep you in the race? Because it will remind you of what he endured to purchase your salvation. This was all for you, believer. All of this, enduring the cross, despising the shame, enduring such hostility from sinners, all of it was for the purpose of atoning for your guilt, for satisfying God's wrath against your unrighteousness, to provide you with the gift of grace and eternal life, to give you intimate fellowship with God and with his people. All of this was for you. And you will never run the race of faith with any kind of consistency, let alone any kind of success, until that fact grips you every single day of your life. That Jesus Christ did this for you if you trust in him. I don't know how many of you remember, I don't know if it was 20, 25 years ago, what would Jesus do? The little bracelets? Who cares? The better question is, what has Jesus done? That's what really matters, because that's how you finish the race. Consider him. Consider what he's done. Consider the opposition that he faced and how he ran that race perfectly. Some of you are old enough to remember the 1968 Olympics held in Mexico City. And as always at the Olympics, the final event is the marathon, right? That 26.2 grueling race of endurance. Several miles into the marathon at the Olympics that year, this runner from Tanzania, John Stephen Akarwi, he found himself in the middle of this group of runners, and they were kind of jockeying for position. You know how that goes, rubbing into each other. He falls to the ground, gashing and dislocating his knee. He smashes his shoulder into the pavement. He actually gets trampled on, stepped on by several other runners before he's able to get back to his feet. And as was expected, the favorite in the race, Mamo Volde of Ethiopia, he crossed the finish line first to the cheers of about 100,000 spectators there in the stadium. And then he's followed pretty closely by most of the other runners. Over an hour later, after the sun had set and most of the crowd had gone home, John Stephen Akarwi from Tanzania limps into the stadium with his bandaged leg. And when he finally crosses the finish line, he collapses into the arms of the medical personnel who were there waiting for him, and they immediately took him to the hospital. And the next day, there was a press conference, and the reporters asked him, "Why didn't you drop out of the race when you knew that you could never win?" And he said, "My country did not send me 5,000 miles to start the race. They sent me 5,000 miles to finish the race." Now you're starting to see what the Christian life really is. It's not a decision of faith. It's not a prayer of faith that you pray once. It is a life of faith. Please understand. Let me be clear on this. The Christian life is not a picnic. It is not a pleasure cruise. It is not a vacation. It is not a bed and breakfast. It is not your best life now. It is a race. It is strenuous. Sometimes it's discouraging. Occasionally, it's hostile. And remember, the reward is not given to those who merely begin the race, but only to those who successfully finish it. Only those, as Jesus says, who continue to the end will be saved. So you fix your eyes on Jesus. How do you run? Listen. Listen to the testimony of those who finish the race. Divest yourself of everything that impedes your progress, and focus. Focus your attention on the greatest of all runners, because he's already there. He's standing at the finish line. He's waiting to crown you with the victor's cries. And even now, he's standing there calling out to you, keep running to me. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus. That's how you run the race. And that's the only way you will finish the race. The question is, are you in the race? Yes, the most important thing is, do you finish? But to finish, you have to start running. Have you trusted in the person and work of Jesus Christ to accomplish the forgiveness of your sins and to achieve eternal reconciliation with God? Because he came and lived and died and rose again for that very purpose, so that you might place your faith in him and turn from your sin and receive eternal life. We spent most of our time talking about how to run the race, how to finish the race. But if you're ready to start running because you never have before, I would love to talk with you about that. Come find me afterwards. Let's pray.
We would like to thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. This podcast is a ministry of Victory Baptist Church in Hermiston, Oregon. You can find us at 193 East Main Street in Hermiston, Oregon, 97838, or on the web at yourvictory.org.